November 1942, Guadalcanal. The air hangs thick with rot and humidity, and somewhere in the dense jungle darkness, a Marine corporal crouches in a muddy foxhole. His M1 Garand is out of ammunition. His bayonet was lost 2 days ago when his rifle stock shattered against a tree during a night firefight. The Thompson submachine gun he carried ran dry an hour before dawn, and there are no more magazines. In the pre-dawn silence, he hears movement, footsteps, breathing. The enemy is close, perhaps 10 feet away, invisible in the shadows of the rainforest canopy. The corporal's hand moves instinctively to his belt, fingers wrapping around a leather handle. He draws 7 inches of American steel, marked with 2 words stamped into the blade: KA-BAR and USMC. In that moment, as the space between survival and death collapses to arm's length, this knife stops being equipment and becomes something else entirely. It becomes a weapon of last resort, a tool of desperation, and ultimately, a symbol that will define Marine Corps identity for the next 8 decades. This is the story of the KA-BAR fighting utility knife, a blade forged not in the romantic tradition of medieval swordcraft, but in the cold calculus of industrial war production, metallurgical compromise, and the brutal lessons learned in close-quarters jungle combat, where conventional firearms failed and only steel remained. Before the KA-BAR existed, the United States Marine Corps faced a crisis that military historians often overlook when discussing World War II logistics. The Corps entered the war without a standardized fighting knife, and this wasn't merely an administrative oversight. It represented a fundamental gap in the Marine infantryman's combat loadout, a gap that became lethally apparent in the Pacific theater, where the nature of warfare deviated dramatically from European conventional doctrine. Marines deploying to Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Solomon Islands carried a chaotic assortment of blades. Some had Mark I trench knives left over from the First World War, brutal knuckle-duster weapons designed for the static, confined brutality of Western Front trench raids. Others carried civilian hunting knives purchased from hardware stores and sporting goods shops with their own money, blades never intended for combat use and prone to failure under the stress of military application. Still others carried nothing but the M1 Garand bayonet, a weapon optimized for mounting on a rifle and nearly useless as an independent fighting tool due to its excessive length, poor balance, and inadequate handle design. The Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife, that elegant double-edged stiletto favored by British commandos and SOE operatives, was occasionally seen in Marine hands, acquired through informal channels or brought back from joint training exercises. But the Fairbairn-Sykes, for all its deadly efficiency in the hands of trained knife fighters, suffered from a critical design flaw when deployed in the harsh environmental conditions of the Pacific. Its thin, narrow blade, optimized for penetration and thrusting attacks against vital organs, proved too fragile for utility work. The blade would snap when used to pry open ammunition crates, bend when employed to dig fighting positions in coral sand, and corrode rapidly in the salt-saturated humidity of tropical islands. What Marines needed wasn't an assassin's blade.
They needed a tool that could kill when necessary, but survive the 10,000 other tasks that infantry combat demanded.
On December 9th, 1942, the Union Cutlery Company of Olean, New York, submitted a prototype knife to the United States Marine Corps quartermaster for evaluation. Union Cutlery wasn't a prestigious arms manufacturer. They had built their reputation on producing affordable hunting and utility knives for the American sporting goods market. Blades sold through mail-order catalogs and hardware store displays. But war creates opportunity, and Union Cutlery's management understood that military contracts represented a pathway to survival in an economy increasingly dominated by defense production. The company had been using the trademark KA-BAR since 1923, a name whose origin remains disputed to this day, though the most commonly cited story involves a testimonial letter from a fur trapper who allegedly wrote that he used his knife to kill a bear after his rifle misfired, the phrase KA-BAR supposedly being his phonetic spelling of kill a bear in broken English. Whether this origin story is authentic or marketing mythology is irrelevant. What matters is that by December 1942, the name KA-BAR was about to become synonymous with Marine Corps infantry combat.
The knife that Union Cutlery submitted for evaluation was designated the Mark II Fighting Utility Knife, a name that perfectly captured its dual-purpose design philosophy. The blade measured exactly 7 inches in length, a dimension carefully calculated to provide maximum reach in close quarters combat, without becoming unwieldy in confined spaces like bunkers, caves, or the dense undergrowth of jungle warfare. The blade was forged from 1095 carbon steel, a material choice that represented a calculated compromise between competing metallurgical demands. 1095 carbon steel contains approximately 0.95% carbon content, which provides excellent edge retention and ease of sharpening, critical factors for a blade that would see constant use in field conditions far from professional sharpening equipment. However, 1095 carbon steel is not stainless and requires regular maintenance to prevent corrosion, a significant vulnerability in the salt air and humidity of Pacific Island warfare. The Marine Corps accepted this trade-off because a blade that could be field sharpened with a whetstone or even a flat rock was more valuable than a corrosion-resistant blade that couldn't be restored once its factory edge was lost. The blade was heat-treated to a Rockwell hardness of 56 to 58 HRC, a specification that balanced hardness for edge retention against toughness to resist fracture under lateral stress. A harder blade would hold an edge longer, but would be prone to chipping or snapping if used for prying or batoning. A softer blade would be more durable, but would require constant resharpening. The 56 to 58 HRC range represented the optimal point on that curve for a multi-purpose infantry knife.
The blade geometry of the KA-BAR reveals sophisticated understanding of combat knife requirements that goes far beyond simple manufacturing expediency. The knife features a clip-point blade design, where the spine of the blade curves downward toward the tip in a concave arc. This creates a thin, acute point optimized for penetration, allowing the blade to slip between ribs or pierce through heavy clothing and equipment without requiring excessive force. The clip point design also raises the point of the blade above the center line of the handle,
which improves control during precise cutting tasks and reduces the likelihood of the blade binding in deep cuts. The blade features a flat grind, meaning the blade tapers from the spine to the edge in a single flat plane, rather than a convex or hollow grind. Flat grinds are optimal for knives subjected to heavy lateral stress because they provide maximum blade strength and resistance to bending or snapping. A small fuller, commonly but incorrectly called a blood groove, runs along the length of the blade near the spine. This fuller serves two purposes. It reduces the overall weight of the blade without significantly compromising strength, and it reduces friction during penetration by decreasing the surface area of the blade in contact with the target. Contrary to popular mythology, the fuller does not create suction that makes withdrawal difficult, nor does it channel blood. It is purely a weight reduction and friction reduction feature.
The handle of the K-bar represents one of the most distinctive and recognizable design elements in military knife history. The handle is constructed from stacked leather washers, compressed and secured between the tang of the blade and a steel butt cap. Each leather washer is approximately 1/8 inch thick, and the entire handle contains somewhere between 30 and 40 washers, depending on manufacturing variations and the natural compression of the leather over time. This construction method was not chosen for aesthetic reasons. Stacked leather handles provide several critical functional advantages. First, the material offers excellent grip, even when wet, blood-soaked, or muddy, conditions that would make wooden, plastic, or smooth metal handles dangerously slippery. Second, leather is resilient and slightly compressible, which reduces hand fatigue during extended use and dampens impact shock when the knife is used for chopping or hammering. Third, the grooves between the leather washers create natural texture that prevents hand slippage without requiring aggressive jimping or checkering that would become uncomfortable during prolonged use. Fourth, stacked leather is easy to repair in field conditions. If the handle is damaged, the butt cap can be removed, damaged washers replaced with improvised materials, and the knife returned to service without specialized tools or skills. The handle measures approximately 4.5 inches in length, proportioned to accommodate a wide range of hand sizes while maintaining sufficient blade extension for effective cutting and thrusting. The K-bar features a steel oval guard positioned between the blade and handle. This guard is not decorative. In hand-to-hand combat, particularly when fighting at close quarters in conditions of exhaustion, fear, and deteriorating fine motor control, there is significant risk that the user's hand will slide forward onto the blade during a thrusting attack, particularly if the blade encounters bone or dense tissue that arrests its forward momentum suddenly. The oval guard prevents this forward slide, protecting the user's hand from potentially catastrophic injury that would render them unable to continue fighting. The oval shape, as opposed to a simple straight crossguard, provides protection while minimizing the likelihood of the guard catching on equipment, vegetation, or the user's own gear. The butt cap is constructed from sintered powdered metal and is pinned through the tang to secure the entire handle assembly. The butt cap provides a weighted pommel that improves the knife's balance point and can be used as an improvised hammer for driving tent stakes, breaking up ration crates, or delivering blunt force trauma in close combat when blade deployment is impossible.
The K-bar was issued with a leather sheath featuring a belt loop and tie-down thong. The sheath design was deliberately simple and robust, prioritizing durability and retention security over quick-draw speed. The knife was typically worn on the belt in a cross-draw position or attached to web gear, allowing access without interfering with the movement patterns required for operating rifles, machine guns, or other primary weapon systems. Some Marines modified their sheaths or wore the knife in alternative positions based on personal preference and specific mission requirements. Paratroopers, for example, often secured the knife to their leg or boot to prevent it from being torn away during parachute. Some reconnaissance units sometimes carried the knife inverted on their chest rigs for silent access during ambush scenarios.
The K-Bar entered service in November 1942. And within months it became ubiquitous throughout Marine Corps units deployed in the Pacific Theater. The knife's dual designation as both a fighting knife and a utility knife reflected the reality of infantry combat, where the distinction between weapon and tool dissolved under the pressure of operational necessity. Marines used the K-Bar to open ration cans when P-38 can openers were lost or broken. They used it to cut wire, strip insulation from field telephone cables, and fabricate improvised tools and equipment from salvaged materials. They dug fighting positions in sand and coral when entrenching tools were unavailable, carved stakes for camouflage netting, cut vegetation to create firing lanes and clear fields of fire around defensive positions, and performed field maintenance on equipment that required cutting, prying, or scraping. They hammered tent stakes using the butt cap, opened ammunition crates by prying apart wooden slats, and extracted stuck cartridge cases from rifle chambers when cleaning rods failed. The knife became an extension of the Marine's hand, a universal problem-solving tool that existed outside the rigid categorization of military equipment tables.
But the K-Bar was also a weapon, and in the savage close-quarters combat that characterized Pacific Island warfare, it earned a reputation that transcended its utilitarian origins. Japanese defensive doctrine in the Pacific emphasized night infiltration, close assault, and hand-to-hand combat. Tactical approaches designed to negate American advantages in firepower and artillery support. Japanese soldiers were trained in bayonet combat and carried katana-style swords, and they deliberately sought close engagement where American technological superiority became irrelevant. In these encounters, in the darkness of jungle nights, in the confined spaces of bunker complexes and cave systems, the K-Bar became the weapon of final resort. There are documented accounts of Marines fighting hand-to-hand in conditions where rifles were useless, where the 7-inch blade represented the difference between survival and death. These encounters left psychological marks that went far beyond the physical wounds. A firearm creates distance between killer and killed, but a knife eliminates that distance entirely. The act of killing with a blade is intimate, visceral, and psychologically traumatic in ways that firing a rifle or throwing a grenade can never replicate. Marines who used the K-Bar in combat rarely discussed those experiences in detail, but the knife itself became imbued with symbolic weight that exceeded its tactical importance.
The K-Bar's reputation spread beyond the Marine Corps. Army units operating in the Pacific Theater acquired K-Bar knives through informal channels, supply requisitions, and direct purchase. Navy corpsmen attached to Marine units carried the knife, valuing its utility for medical applications, where scalpel precision was unnecessary, but robust cutting capability was essential. Coast Guard personnel and merchant marine sailors adopted the knife for shipboard use, where its corrosion resistance, despite being minimal, still exceeded that of most alternatives available through naval supply channels. Even some Army Air Forces personnel, particularly bomber crews operating in the Pacific, carried KA-BAR knives as survival equipment, recognizing that a bailout over enemy territory rendered most conventional gear useless, but a reliable knife might mean the difference between survival and capture.
The production of KA-BAR knives during World War II represents a case study in wartime industrial mobilization. Union Cutlery could not meet demand alone, and the Marine Corps contracted with 3 additional manufacturers: Camillus Cutlery Company, Case, and Robeson. Each manufacturer produced knives to the same specifications, but minor variations in manufacturing processes, material sourcing, and quality control created subtle differences that knife collectors and military historians can identify decades later. Some wartime KA-BARs featured red fiber spacers between the guard and handle. Others used black spacers, and still others had no spacer at all. These variations were not design improvements or intentional modifications, but rather artifacts of material shortages and production compromises necessary to maintain output under wartime conditions. The fact that these variations exist and are documented speaks to the cultural significance the knife acquired. Soldiers and Marines cared enough about their KA-BARs to notice these details, to prefer certain manufacturers or production runs, and to develop personal attachments to specific knives that transcended their function as military equipment.
After World War II, the KA-BAR remained in service. It was carried in Korea, where winter conditions revealed new vulnerabilities as leather handles froze and became brittle, where carbon steel blades snapped in sub-zero temperatures, and where Marines learned to warm their knives inside their parkas before use to prevent catastrophic failure. It was carried in Vietnam, where jungle humidity and constant moisture exposure revealed the limits of carbon steel's corrosion resistance, where Marines wrapped their knife handles in paracord to extend grip surface and prevent rot, and where the knife's reputation as a symbol of Marine Corps identity became inseparable from its tactical utility. It remains in production today, manufactured by KA-BAR Knives Incorporated, still featuring the same basic design specifications established in 1942, still carried by Marines deploying to combat zones in the Middle East and Africa, still performing the same dual role of weapon and tool that defined its original purpose. The modern KA-BAR uses updated materials and manufacturing processes. The blade steel is now designated 1095 Chrovan, a proprietary alloy that adds chromium and vanadium to the base 1095 carbon steel formula to improve edge retention and provide marginal corrosion resistance improvements without fundamentally altering the blade's performance characteristics or field maintenance requirements. But the knife remains recognizable,
its silhouette unchanged, its purpose unaltered.
The KA-BAR fighting utility knife succeeded not because it was the sharpest, the strongest, or the most technically advanced blade ever designed. It succeeded because it was good enough across a sufficiently wide range of applications that it could serve as a universal tool in an environment where specialization was a luxury infantry combat could not afford. It succeeded because it could be manufactured in massive quantities, using relatively simple industrial processes and materials that didn't compete with higher priority weapon systems for scarce wartime resources. It succeeded because it was intuitive to use, requiring no specialized training beyond basic knife handling skills that most Americans already possessed from civilian life. And it succeeded because it acquired symbolic meaning that reinforced unit cohesion and individual identity in ways that military planners never anticipated and could never have designed intentionally. The KA-BAR became part of what it meant to be a Marine, a physical embodiment of the Corps' emphasis on adaptability, self-reliance, and the warrior ethos that distinguished Marines from other military branches. When a Marine strapped a KA-BAR to his belt, he wasn't just carrying a knife, he was carrying history, tradition, and the accumulated experience of every Marine who had carried that blade before him. That symbolic weight cannot be measured in Rockwell hardness ratings or blade geometry specifications, but it was as real and as tactically significant as any technical feature of the knife itself. In the end, the KA-BAR's greatest achievement wasn't what it could do, it was what it represented, and that representation, forged in the jungles of Guadalcanal and tempered in 7 decades of continuous service, remains unbroken.